From right here in Hancock County, we're really proud to have with us today Lieutenant Colonel Craig Wagoner, retired U.S. Army. Tell us what was growing up like here in New Pal.
Well, of course, it was good enough that I wanted to come back here and retire here. I graduated from New Palestine High School in '81, and I was one of those kids. I loved being in high school. I could have done another couple of years and just enjoyed high school. I was involved in student government and sports and athletics, and I think it's interesting now, not just New Pal, but all the local schools, how much better the athletic programs are now, how much better the athletes are now. I'm not sure I could have made the team if I were competing against some of the kids today, but it was a great time growing up here. Of course, the whole area has grown a lot since then. I mean, New Pal's grown, and Greenfield and McCordsville and the housing subdivisions have all grown. But I had an opportunity to play football and wrestled and ran track even a couple of years back then. But I was involved in student government, was a class officer, and was heavily involved in Future Farmers of America at the time, and was a state officer with Future Farmers of America. But you know, the economy was tough back there, you know, during the late 70s. Things were tough here in Indiana. The Kokomo automotive plants and other areas around were really suffering, and I worked for a lot of local farms, worked for Lance and Corwin Farms, and lots of good folks in the area, many of which are still here. Coach Shepler was my football coach, and of course he's still on staff teaching at New Palestine High School. And Nadine Shepler was my wife's 5th grade teacher, and she's still teaching and doing a fantastic job, and a number of other folks are still there. But it's interesting, I chose to go in the Army, and I was taking classes at IUPUI, and I knew a number of folks that were graduating, and because they didn't have experience, they were having difficulty getting jobs in the economy at that time. And my dad was in the Army and had retired from the Army, and my grandfather was in the Army, and I thought, you know, I really want to go into the medical field, and I think this would be a good opportunity. And I do think the military can be a good opportunity if you know what you're getting into and you're prepared to make some good choices and be wise about things that you do. And went in and had an opportunity to be trained as a medical lab technician, and enjoyed that process and enjoyed working in a hospital. And of course, Jenny graduated in 1982, and we got married in May of 1983, been married for 32 years, and Jenny's been through 24 moves with us, and we have 6 sons and 5 grandchildren right now. So 6 sons and 3 daughter-in-laws and 5 grandchildren. So kids are now come full cycle. I've got my kids in school here. I've got grandchildren in school at New Palestine, and I've had an opportunity to come back and be involved with the school board and several other things.
You were kind of a military brat yourself. Your father retired, and that's what brought you back to Indiana. What was his last station?
Well, and his last station was Indiana at Fort Harrison. And it's interesting that my dad was a military recruiter, an Army recruiter. Now, he didn't recruit me. He had already retired, but he gave me some good advice. He said, if you're going to go in the Army or you're going to go in any branch of the service, do something that has civilian correlation to it. And that's why I ended up in the medical field. I was interested, and I thought, well, if I go and I do 4 years in the Army, I'll get some training, and then I've got some skills that are pertinent to the civilian community. Not that everything in the military, you know, has direct civilian correlation. Some things don't, but I think that's good advice for a young person, not only to select something that you're interested in, but something that has a future for you as well. Now, I didn't stay in the medical field, but it's interesting that I was in the medical field, was in aviation and a number of other things, but now I've come full circle, and I work for the Department of Veterans Affairs, Veterans Health Administration, and work with veterans health programs on a nationwide basis now. So I guess in a way I have come full circle right back to that medical training that I initially had.
You're with the VA, and you're kind of stepping in to kind of fill in a lot of the problem areas that the VA has had over the last decade or so.
Well, I really enjoy what I do. First off, it's always a blessing to have an opportunity to go, as an example, the Raudebush VA Medical Center here in Indianapolis. Not only am I a customer as a disabled veteran, but I also have an opportunity to work with a lot of our veterans and retirees that are there and their families. And some just have such interesting stories, the things that they've been through. Especially a lot of our older veterans, our Vietnam veterans, some of our Korean War veterans, and those that have just been through some experiences that are very unique, and to see many of them still serving America in a number of capacities. But I have an opportunity to work with specifically opening access to veterans care outside of VA medical centers. I work with a number of programs through the VA Office of Rural Health, and then we work to increase access to care for American Indian, Alaskan Native, Pacific Island Native veterans through other than traditional VA medical centers, so that they can receive care closer to home in a more convenient fashion, and sometimes more conducive to their local customs. For example, if you're a Native American veteran, there are some things that would be culturally sensitive to you and are more available through a Indian Health Service facility or maybe a tribal health facility for something that might be a VA-related injury or illness that you might have. And so there are programs to reimburse them so that you can get that care closer to home. Another area of VA programs that I have an opportunity to work with is through what are called promising practices, literally reviewing the best ideas that are coming out of some of our VA healthcare systems through the rural health system and evaluating them for their impact on veterans, increased access to care, and then how well they perform for our veterans in the medical sense as well. And then rank ordering some of these things and getting us our most veteran impact for our dollar, you might say, I guess just putting it in layman's terms, on an annualized basis. So that's very rewarding. So it's rewarding to have an opportunity to work with veterans and veterans programs. Love being a part of the schools and the school board and having an opportunity to interact with not only Southern Hancock schools but others here in the county, and to be involved with our youth and our youth programs.
30 years in the Army. You've been a little bit everywhere. It was 24 moves.
24 moves.
And 6 kids.
Yeah.
How did that family life carry? Because you had a lot of deployments.
I had a lot of deployments, and there were a lot of times that Jenny has just taken care of everything. Of course, Jenny Wagoner, Jenny James, we grew up across the cornfield from each other here. I can remember before all the subdivisions were built, if you stood on our front porch, it was probably a little more than a quarter mile across the cornfield that you could see her front porch as well. Things have grown a little bit since then, but Jenny's been 32 years this week. Matter of fact, 32 years this week we've been married, celebrating our anniversary. But Jenny has really been the glue, and it's appropriate that we've celebrated Mother's Day because she's been the great mom for our family and great example, great wife.
Now your kids, some have gone on into the military.
We've had 2 sons go into the military. Jordan was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and Jordan was our 4th son, and John was our 3rd son. He's currently stationed at the White House. Now he has an interesting job. He's part of the White House communication team, so he has traveled with the president literally around the world, and the vice president, and a number of things. So because of his position, the last time we went to visit him in Washington, we got a tour of the West Wing. So we had an opportunity to go see the Oval Office and the Cabinet Office and where the president does his interviews from. Just all very interesting. But I do want to say, in the Rose Garden, I didn't see any roses, so I'm not sure why it gained that name. But anyway, he's enjoying being in the military, and I would say to any young person thinking about going in the military, research the jobs that you're going into. There are great opportunities and great benefits out there. Just make sure that it's for you before you sign up.
When you were moving around so much, how did the kids adapt to that?
You know, that's one of the things that drew us back here to Indiana, because obviously we've been involved with a lot of school districts through the years. We've lived in areas where literally our guys were the minorities in the school, and they were excellent schools in McDonough, Georgia. We've lived in Kansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, Georgia, just really all over the country, but came back here to Indiana because of the great upbringing that we had. Interesting thing though, it takes a strong family to move kids that many times. And it takes good kids. And Jenny and I, we appreciate all of our sons and just the wonderful guys that they are and the way they adapted every time that we moved and just fit right in and made friends and joined sports teams and just did all the things you hoped that they would do.
So many deployments and so forth, and 6 kids. Were you able to be there for all 6 births?
I was not. As a matter of fact, our 2nd son, I was on a training deployment, and Jenny had gone into labor early. And so they had put me on a Black Hawk helicopter, but it was multiple hours away from Fort Rucker, Alabama. And I was late getting back for Chris's birth, but I was actually there for all the others, which worked out great.
And where do you go from here?
Well, What's next? I don't know. I think the next 15, 16 years, just being involved with the local community through schools. Definitely enjoy working for the Veterans Administration. Wherever I go, it's going to be with Jenny, or hopefully wherever Jenny goes, it'll be with me. But I think we're settled down here. We're enjoying not moving anymore.
Grandkids?
Enjoy those grandkids. You know what's great about grandkids? You can spoil them, have a great time, but you don't have to be the bad guy and put them to bed.
Do they enjoy hearing the war stories and the experiences of overseas?
You know, Jenny tells me all the time I need to write a book, and I've taken down a number of notes. I'm not necessarily a big storyteller, and I think it's really on rare occasion that I really talk about stories. And matter of fact, I was asked the other day whether I have seen the movie American Sniper, and I haven't, because I key in too much on the detail. There are a lot of things I'm sure Hollywood does to make the movie for effect, but you know, since 2003, I've spent 54 months in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so you tend to pick up on a lot of detail, and movies and things like that make me smell certain things. That's probably an odd thing to say, but I think a lot of folks would understand there are certain smells and connotation that goes on with different things that have happened with veterans, and I've just bypassed a lot of those movies and things for those reasons.
Well, the war movies have a different meaning to those who have been there.
Yeah, and I really appreciate families, and you know, as an example, the brigade I was with in Afghanistan, we lost 54 soldiers, and you know, you just appreciate those families that have sacrificed so much.
Well, how did things get started?
Well, I enlisted in the Army. I was a medical lab technician. Enjoyed being in the medical field, stationed at Fort Sam Houston. And I got a ride in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter in 1984. And quite honestly, I thought, this beats the heck out of checking urine samples. Flying treetop level with the doors off. And I remember we landed, and I asked one of the crew members, and I don't remember if it was one of the pilots or one of the crew chiefs in the back, hey, how do you get involved in aviation? And of course, this was all pre-computer, and if you wanted to apply for something like that, you had to go find the regulation, type it up on an old regular typewriter, and then mail it off. Well, I put an application together, followed the instructions the best I knew how, mailed off an application, and about 6 months later, I got a letter in the mail telling me I had an interview and had an opportunity to interview to go to flight school. Great opportunity. Ended up getting selected to go to Fort Rucker, Alabama. Finished towards the top of my class. There was one gentleman who beat me out. Joe Sharp was the honor graduate, and I was right behind him. And we had an opportunity to be the first two out of flight school to turn right around and start flying H-64 Apache helicopters. So I started flying Apaches in May of 1986, and have had an opportunity to fly for a little over 28 years as an active aviator. And was stationed with lots of different units, numbers of the divisions through the years. But really one of my earliest recollections from combat operations was from Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Of course, as we transitioned from Desert Shield to Desert Storm, one of my very best memories is as attack helicopter platoon leader. We'd moved into a position very close to the Iraqi border, preparing to open up some air corridors, go in and take out some radar sites for fast movers to be able to come in over us and really kick off the pounding operation, the ground operation. And General Griffith was our commanding general, Major General Griffith. And I remember just as we were in position a few kilometers from the Iraqi border, just as it got dark, he flew forward, and we heard a Black Hawk, and he landed. Of course, we didn't know it was him at the time. And his aide came running over and said, hey, the commanding general's here, and he wants to see all the guys that are flying tonight. And so we had an opportunity to go over and meet with Major General Griffith, and it was almost one of those Eisenhower type moments where just getting dark, could just make out his face, had flashlights with maps, and had an opportunity to talk to the commanding general about our mission. And I remember him saying, I just want to look in the eyes of the 1st Armored Division soldiers to cross into Iraq, and just how excited and how proud he was. And it just was surreal almost as we began that operation. Of course, we flew into Iraq that night, and there was lots of success, and that was one of the successes because of just a great team effort, a lot of people involved with that. But as we flew back into Saudi Arabia that night, probably one of the things that didn't make the highlights of the paper, we flew back into a sandstorm, a shamal, landing back into northern Iraq to Tactical Assembly Area Mike. And some of this is recounted in a book, 1st Armored Division, Iron Soldiers, 1st Armored Division in the First Gulf War. And I was the battalion flight lead, and as I landed, Chalk 2, number 2 aircraft, decided he liked my parking space as well as he did, and number 2 literally landed to my aircraft, destroyed 2 aircraft, broke out all of my teeth. So a very successful mission ends up with all of my teeth broken out and 2 aircraft destroyed. Interestingly enough, I had no idea that my teeth were broken out just because of the adrenaline of the mission and everything that had gone on until the flight surgeon came into our tent to check me. And he said, "Hey, Lieutenant, we're going to have to do something about those teeth." And at that point, my brain switched back on and could feel the pain of those broken teeth, just like somebody had taken a bayonet and shoved it into my upper gum. But interesting things you don't think about being in combat, how there are emergency dental kits. And the next morning we flew off to a place called King Khalid Military City, got 2 new aircraft and rejoined the fight and never missed anything. Interesting though, my wife Jenny and I both graduated from high school here in Hancock County, and my wife had received a phone call with very incomplete information about me being in an accident, and they were hoping I was okay. Well, of course, she knew nothing of this. We'd been months since we talked on the phone. It's not like things are today with internet and instant messaging and Facebook and Twitter accounts and 24-hour CNN news and all these types of things that are going on. So very interesting dynamic changes from the first Gulf War to my last experiences being in Iraq as an attack helicopter pilot in desert, beyond Desert Shield and Desert Storm. In Iraqi Freedom, things changed a lot, aircraft changed a lot, tactics and techniques changed a lot, and of course world communications changed a lot in all that time. In the first Gulf War, we used to try to listen to the BBC in the evening to hear General Schwarzkopf. We had 1 medium wave radio amongst our entire company to listen to, and we took cable and wire and made a loop antenna to try to hear the London broadcast. Whereas now, deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan, I've deployed to Iraq 3 times and Afghanistan once for a total of 54 months of deployment in the last several years. There's instant news. You know everything that's going on all the time. So things have certainly changed through the years from the first Gulf War through Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom.
During that first stages of the war, what were your targets?
During the first stages of the war, initially they were anti-aircraft sites. And then we very, very quickly switched to armor and anti-armor weapons. Very close combat between attack helicopters and our ground infantry and armor brigades in 1st Armored Division. There were times where literally the tanks were arrayed across the battlefield and we were right over the top of them. The attack helicopters, we took deep targets and the tanks took close targets. So very, very coordinated operation.
We've heard all kinds of stories about the tanks, that it was pretty much a shooting gallery as far as being able to find them and to eliminate them.
It was very interesting in that for our tank gunners, like our attack helicopter pilots, first time to have an opportunity to fire on a 2-way range. And so our sights and optics on our tanks were so good, and the ability to see across the desert, they would actually shoot at targets that were far beyond anything they would have ever shot at in training. And just the numbers of targets that were available as well was far beyond what I expected.
Well, you talk about training. How different was this from your training? Was it kind of unexpected, or was it what you did expect?
The skills you gain in that rope memorization and muscle memory and working in the aircraft every day instantly kicked in, just like somebody who's involved in athletics or sports, training over and over and over to that technique. That all kicked in. What I didn't realize as an attack helicopter pilot, how you don't have the outside sounds. For example, you hear your rockets or your missile fire, but you don't hear the explosion. You see it, So it's almost like an advanced version of a video game. I can still remember one very, very close encounter. A good friend of mine, Lieutenant Davis, was flying an OH-58 Scout. And I remember just saying on the radio, Chris, you're gonna need to slide left. There's a guy trying to shoot you from below, and just firing under his aircraft. So some things were almost surreal in the distance and the targets, and some things were very, very close up. But not hearing the sounds of the combat, but being able to see the shock waves of the tank was something I'd never thought about.
Hi, may I please have an application? Thank you.
Skip the drama. Get your diploma.
Okay.
Take that first step towards a better future. Find free adult education classes at finishyourdiploma.org.
Flying into combat, of course, is tense enough, and you already had an accident your first day out. How did the rest of the war go?
It went well, obviously. The interesting thing was some things that I don't think we'll ever see again that came out of the first Gulf War. When you talk about something like an entire corps, an armored corps, like 7th Corps that was out of Germany involved in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, being able to see an entire armored corps arrayed across a desert like you would never have space to do again. I think the whole face of combat and war has changed. All the capabilities have changed, but that was something that was just absolutely spectacular. Would make me think of something like Patton and Rommel in North Africa from World War II, the number of armored vehicles that were involved in Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And then really transitioning as we went into Operation Iraqi Freedom. Because Iraqi Freedom began very similarly, and of course at that time I was an attack helicopter pilot. I was promoted, I was a major at the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And we had an Army division and we had the Marines involved at the same time, but in a much different operation. We had a limited scope when we were in Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, liberating Kuwait. The decision was made to not take over Iraq for a number of political reasons, I'm sure. But as we went into Operation Iraqi Freedom, we were literally looking to take over the entire country of Iraq. But the topography of Iraq is very interesting. In southern Iraq, extremely hot as the winds blow across Syria and western Iraq in the summertime, very easily hit above 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which is so hot that you either want to wear a pair of gloves or pull your hands into your sleeves because the wind feels like a blow dryer. And all the way to northern Iraq and the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates. So very interesting as an attack helicopter pilot during Iraqi Freedom, having an opportunity to operate. Really initially during that conflict in 2000, coming out of 2003 and into 2004, almost started out as a low-level conflict, and then it began as the insurgency really began to build. I can remember, landing and walking into Tikrit and in the Baghdad area without body armor on in 2003, but as things really began to ramp up, as we headed into 2004, everybody was looking to put on some body armor. So things really changed during that time. One of the interesting things I had an opportunity to do in early 2004, as the coalition really began to build, was I became a liaison officer to a Polish aviation unit. Now, I had never flown anything but U.S. made aircraft and was used to the U.S. Aviation training regimens that we go through, very rote, very in-depth with academics. And I joined this 25th Iraqi Polish Air Cavalry Unit, flying Russian-made Mi-8 HIP aircraft and Mi-24 attack helicopters, Hind attack helicopters. And my first day on the job, I thought I was going to ride in the back of a Hind aircraft as a passenger, and the commander of the unit looked at me and said, "You're a pilot, right?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Here's a helmet." Gave me a helmet and put me in the pilot and command seat in this Russian-made Mi-8 HIP aircraft, and Mi-17 HIP aircraft, and everything in the aircraft turns opposite. If you can just imagine, like the rotor blades turn the opposite direction, which means a lot of your controls are just opposite of what you've been doing for the last 15, 18 years as far as flying. Of course, nothing's in English, everything is in Russian Cyrillic. The good thing was all the gauges had the same colors. White for, red for avoid zones, white for transition zones, yellow for caution areas, and green's good. So the first thing, we started this aircraft and he gave me the controls and took off flying. There was no instruction. He just assumed you're a U.S. pilot. And that's kind of the assumption around the world. You're a military officer from America, from the United States. You should already know all of these things. And so I had an opportunity to fly with them, flew with them from the point we took their aircraft off their ships to flew them up to an area called Babel, think of the Babylonian Empire, and to an area called Forward Operating Base Echo, and operated with them for a number of months throughout the rest of my tour, principally doing air escort missions with them. Very interesting group, operating with a foreign international partner as opposed to being with a U.S. unit.
When you took off the first time, how long did it take you before you really felt comfortable in the air with everything being the opposite?
Once I got up off the ground and transitioned from a hover to forward flight, everything was fine. If you can imagine, and for years that I'd been flying, when you give what's called forward cyclic for forward movement or increased power, you would always push left pedal. Kind of just the opposite. Instead of left pedal, push right pedal, and that has a lot to do with the trim, and without getting into a lot of the aerodynamics of the aircraft, just all of the turn forces are exactly opposite of U.S. aircraft. It wasn't the takeoff that made me so nervous. Once I got it up to a hover, everything was fine. But it was that coming in for a landing the very first time, back to a deck. We were right on the Persian Gulf, coming back into the port of Ashweba, where we were assembling their aircraft, landing to a very tight zone in an aircraft. This was literally my first 15 minutes ever flying this aircraft, and landing with lots of folks watching. So it was an interesting experience. I think that also helped me gain some credibility with them, which is very important when you're a liaison officer working with an international partner. Very interesting tour in 2003, 2004. We saw lots of things change, but my next tour to Iraq, I had an opportunity to be a military advisor working with 2 Iraqi infantry battalions with a great group as part of what's called a military transition team. The Army sent me for a little bit of language training, cultural training, and then myself and a group of about 31 other Americans lived with 664 Iraqi infantry battalion soldiers, 55 kilometers or about 32 miles from the closest U.S. facility, and operated with them for 13 months. Very difficult operations, very different operations working with them, but we saw a lot of improvement in that unit as well. Learned to watch Al Jazeera in Arabic, drank a lot of chai tea, and I can definitely tell you the difference between eating sheep and eating lamb, and there is a big difference. So very interesting, but that was really my first opportunity to operate as an infantryman, which kind of began a transition in my career as I was getting promoted to lieutenant colonel. The pyramid gets very, very tight and looking for opportunities to command. I actually ended up commanding an infantry training battalion at the end of my career as I moved a little bit away from aviation as I got promoted. But it was a rewarding assignment, worked with a great number of soldiers, but were involved in a lot of operations that really brought you face to face with what was going on in Iraq. Operations in an area called Al-Qut, surviving some IED situations and very close combat situations without the U.S. military backup that you're used to having. There's a great deal of confidence that comes with having U.S. air power and U.S. artillery, as opposed to relying on your Iraqi partners for all of those types of things, which generally don't happen in a very coordinated fashion. So I was very fortunate, I think, to survive that tour. Great group of American, tight-knit group of 31. You become very tight-knit when it's just you. And I was also glad to survive that tour without any parasitic infections, which was very different. So
you transitioned basically from flying attack helicopters to commanding some ground troops. How radically different was that for you?
Well, I was an enlisted soldier and then was a warrant officer flying aircraft, so I'd gone to the infantry officer candidate school. So I'd been through Fort Benning, and then I had also had an opportunity as a commissioned officer when I was a lieutenant before taking command. Because I had already done some of the advanced warrant officer training, I was given an opportunity to choose what's called an alternate captain's career course. So instead of going to the aviation captain's career course, I went to the armor school at Fort Knox. So in my early years as a commissioned officer, I had a good mix of aviation training, infantry training, and artillery and armor training, which definitely came in handy towards the end of my career. The interesting thing about that particular assignment, I had expected it to be a lot of training, but we ended up doing a lot more operations and a lot more logistics with our Iraqi partners than we did training, simply because the pace of operations demanded it. They were needed in the fight. That particular Iraqi battalion, those 2 battalions on either side of the Tigris River, we controlled an area about 45 kilometers east and west and almost 90 kilometers north and south. So pretty good area of operation, especially during some of the Shia and uprising that was going on in Iraq during that time.
What was your interaction with the locals like?
Varied. It varied. We became the face of America. One of the things that we did on particular projects in that area in order to increase security was we tried to turn dollars in their local economy. We went from the first month that we were there as a military transition team to having more than 50 significant activities a month. A significant activity is a bomb, an IED, an indirect fire, rockets, mortar attacks, a local official being killed. To the last month that I was there, we had 2. So we could see that, and part of that was because the economy began to improve, the infrastructure began to improve. So we worked with local police, mayors, sheikhs, which is like a mayor, sub-sheikhs, tribal leaders all the time, so that they gained more responsibility. It does bother me to see some of the things that have begun to unravel in Iraq because of the societal changes that have occurred there here in the last several months. But it was very rewarding to work with some of our Iraqi partners. But again, just the young American soldiers, when you operate in a remote site like that together, you become very, very tight-knit.
They said a bottle was just a bottle. That no one would ever notice me. But I knew I could be more. That one day, I would make people smile.
Then we move into Afghanistan, and you had a lot more actual combat activity.
Afghanistan was interesting. I had been the executive officer for a 3-star general, Lieutenant General Miller, with 1st Army headquarters in Atlanta. And one of the things I wanted to do as I was getting towards the latter portion of my career, coming up on 27 years, was I wanted to see if I could get here to Indiana for my last assignment to make the transition to retirement better. Of course, no better place to live than Hancock County, and trying to get right back here to New Palestine. And so I talked to Lieutenant General Miller. I say, hey, sir, you know, what can I do to get an assignment to Indiana? Because there are not very many regular Army officers assignments in Indiana. A handful, 5, 6 total. A lot of National Guard, a lot of reserve opportunities, but as a regular Army officer. And he said, Craig, the road to Indiana is through Afghanistan. I've got a command I'd love to put you in, but you've got to be coming right off a deployment to Afghanistan, because that particular job trains units, National Guard, Army Reserve, Marine Corps, Reserve, Air Force, Navy, et cetera, that are going to Afghanistan, Horn of Africa, and so you have to be up on the latest techniques and procedures. And as crazy as it sounds, I said, if it'll get me to Indiana, sign me up for one more deployment. So they gave me an opportunity to choose. The Army is good. If you volunteer for a job that a lot of folks don't necessarily want, they're real good about giving you what you ask for on the back end, should you survive to get the reward on the back end. And so they gave me an opportunity to deploy in a choice of 5 different brigades. I could deploy and train with a brigade out of Fort Drum, New York. Well, no, there's a lot of snow up there. Wasn't really interested in that. One out of North Carolina. Well, I wasn't airborne qualified, so wasn't sure I wanted to go to Fort Bragg. Or with a brigade out of Fort Riley, Kansas. Well, I'd been to Kansas, and and I didn't want to be in Kansas anymore, or Fort Lewis, Washington, which wouldn't have been bad, or I could deploy with a brigade out of Hawaii. Now, we'd never been to Hawaii. So the choice wasn't tough. I chose to deploy with a brigade out of Hawaii. So the Army sent me from Georgia. I actually moved myself here to Indiana for the transition, and then I went to Hawaii and trained with 4th Brigade, 25th Infantry Division, and deployed to Afghanistan with them. The interesting thing about being in Hawaii, we didn't actually do a lot of training in Hawaii. So I went to Hawaii, and then we went to California for training. But I deployed with a great unit, great brigade commander, good group of guys. But again, as a military advisor, I lived with, this time, an Afghan military unit. And some folks have heard of the show, I'm sure, Restrepo, which is the valley, the Pesh River Valley in Afghanistan. And that's where we operated in northern Kunar province and actually up in the Nuristan province of Afghanistan, an area called Bargi Matal, which would be absolutely beautiful for ecological tourism or kayaking or all types of wonderful outdoor sports if people weren't trying to kill you. So, I mean, just beautiful areas of the world. But interesting thing there, very limited terrain. If you can imagine, helicopters that operate literally restricted to the valleys because the mountain peaks are 17, 18, 21,000 feet. Very difficult operating, very close to the Pakistan border. Most of the people we fought with our Afghan partners there, transitioned across that meaningless line on the map between Afghanistan and Pakistan on a daily basis. Tribes overlap, families overlap that boundary, but we would literally be in operations on a semi-daily basis with insurgents coming over the line from Pakistan. Very limited road network. Makes it very difficult to move around. We used aircraft quite a bit. We used Afghan aircraft, the fledgling Afghan Air Force using Mi-17 aircraft, dropping us into LZs. But most of the operations that we would do with our Afghan partners, the U.S. military would provide the logistics support, and the Afghans were providing the major bulk of the combat operations. Operation Fire Rock was one in particular. Operation Fire Rock, we were put in by Black Hawk helicopter and Chinook helicopter up on mountainsides. At really the end of their performance, they were putting us into LZs at about 10,500 feet. And then we would operate and fight laterally or down the mountain. But what on a map might look like if you were just walking with 75, 85 pounds of gear, might take you an hour in that mountainous terrain, would be all day. You would be all day going 2.5, 3.5 kilometers with sporadic fighting. Most of the fighting that we did in the mountains was at semi-long range. That was with 50 caliber machine guns or our mortar teams, or they were firing back at us what are called Dishka, which are Russian-made heavy machine guns. But it would be very clear to us when we would set up what we would call a strong point operation. That is putting ourselves into a position that we could control terrain with our Afghan partners. We could definitely tell the difference between those we were fighting that were locals, who knew the terrain and stayed off of the trails, or those that were simply coming across the Pakistan border for a day fight or what they thought was a day fight, because they would literally walk up the trails. You'd shoot 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 of them. Fighting would subside. Half hour later, another group would be coming across a mountain trail. 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 of them. You'd kill them there, and then 5, 6 hours later, same thing, group of insurgents coming across the border. But really towards the end of that tour, the Americans in our brigade, we were really backing away from the direct fight, and those of us that were with the military transition teams were continuing on with our Afghan partners. That was really a tour. I was not certain that things were going to go well a number of times, simply because you know what you can count on with a U.S. soldier, U.S. Marine, or airman, or sailor who's out there with you. You know they're going to continue their mission. You don't necessarily know that's the case when your partner is an Afghan partner, when he might ditch his uniform and be gone. And we had that happen. Then we also got into the situation where We had soldiers in our brigade that were part of our transition teams that were killed by some of our Afghan partners. I know the news like to make it out as someone wearing an Iraqi uniform, or an Afghan uniform, but they were folks that were a part of the Afghan military. And so that became a challenge too. Really starts to break down that trust with your partners there.
How did that wear on you mentally?
It really does. It really does wear on you mentally, because you know that you have to have a level of trust with your partner. But you also know that you have a very high level of distrust with your partner. Through the ranks of the Afghan military, those higher ranking, I had very close relationships. As a matter of fact, I have had communications with a number of them, exchanged gifts when I left, had very good experiences with senior Afghan military folks. But the challenge becomes, if you can imagine, in a society where there are no actual birth records, other than outside the tribal references, and each individual valley, different dialect may be spoken. And although we're very used to a central government here in America, and the term doesn't even sound right, central government in America, but when you live someplace like Afghanistan and you are 75, 100 miles from Kabul, Kabul could be on another planet as far as you're concerned. There's not easy transportation. You probably have never been there. It's a distant society, and so really what you care about is what's happening in your valley, what's happening with your clan, or what's happening with your tribe. And that's one thing that really became a challenge, is how to really break down those societal differences as we're operating in some of those particular areas. Probably the most difficult mission we ever did was one that was called Operation Cayena Point. On the island of Oahu, where we were based out of, Cayena Point is a point on the northwest corner of the island where the road's incomplete, very difficult to get to. Well, Cayena Point was a very, proper term, because we were really fighting to clear a road to an area called Perun. Well, Perun is the capital of Nuristan. If I were to compare that road to any road here in eastern Indiana, think of the very worst, muddiest, most difficult road to travel. That would be the road to Perun, and that's considered the major road and the only road to get there. And when you only have one way to go, then the insurgents and those you're operating against know you only have one way to go. That simply was supposed to be a 72-hour operation, turned into 7 days of just continuous fighting. And I was with an Afghan unit. We were with an Afghan unit. We had U.S. military vehicles, but operating with an Afghan unit. And there were times where our very small contingent of 18 Americans had to take the lead in order to keep things moving. There's not a choice to turn around. There's nowhere to turn around. You can't turn around on the road. So the only thing you can do is continue to go forward. So very difficult, but again, just a great unit. And probably the most surreal thing that came out of that particular operation, on the day that I was leaving, which was Easter 2012, I think it was April the 8th, just after midnight coming into Easter, I left my patrol base and flew by Black Hawk to Jalalabad. Had my bag checked at Jalalabad before I got onto a C-130. Flew on a C-130 direct to Kyrgyzstan, almost 6 hours on a C-130. At Kyrgyzstan, got off the aircraft, had a chance to brush my teeth. I shaved, waited for a C-17 aircraft, flew C-17 to Alaska, and in Alaska transitioned to a civilian commercial airliner that was chartered for our unit, and then flew direct to Hawaii. So I arrived in Hawaii, same calendar day, because we crossed this international date line. My family was not in Hawaii at the time, so we had a ceremony of sorts at the airfield, and I had a friend give me a ride to go get a rental car. So I've just left Afghanistan. I go get a rental car. I'm renting a place at a Marriott resort in Hawaii. So within the same calendar day that I leave a patrol base in the Pesh River Valley, I arrived at the Kolina Marriott Resort. There is swim gear and things there, and I remember thinking I wanted to go get something to eat. I thought, no, I'm going to go get in the water today. And so I walked about 7 minutes to the beach from where I was staying, and I remember floating in the water just thinking, all these people are on vacation, and I left the Pesh River Valley this morning, and they have no idea that there's a war going on. And I just remembered that being the most surreal thought as I was just kind of bobbing in the water there at the Colina Marriott Resort.
I stand up.
I stand up for my school.
I stand up.
I stand up for my family.
I stand up.
I stand up for my team.
I stand up.
I stand up for my community.
We stand up to the pressure of alcohol and drug use.
Colonel, you kind of ran the gamut. You started off as an enlisted man in the medical field. You stepped into pilot training and became a warrant officer. Then you got your commission as a lieutenant. You flew attack helicopters. You transitioned to running ground troops and combat missions. You've kind of run it all, and you've had some very exciting events, but where'd you fall flat on your face?
I'll tell you, as you mentioned that, I think about the first Gulf War during the Desert Shield phase. I was with an aviation battalion as a young lieutenant. You know, the Super Bowl right there at the end of January. Well, the ground war kicked off about mid-February, and I remember we got a tape of the Super Bowl, and I think the Giants played that year, and it might have been the Broncos, but I know it was the Giants played. And we had one tent, one medium-sized tent that had a VCR in it that you could go watch videos. And a bunch of us went and watched the Super Bowl. And you know, when you haven't seen any television or anything for months and months at a time, I was fascinated. I had to watch it 2 or 3 times just to see if the same team would keep winning. But you know, during the course of that, the sun went down. And generally, when you're navigating in the desert, you learn all types of things, how to find the North Star. And I knew that from where I was to where I needed to go was west. And if I walked with the North Star off my right shoulder, I'd eventually find it. You know things like your pace count. I know for every 34 steps I take, it's approximately 100 meters, and so I can measure distance and all of these type things. Well, I had come out from this tent, and I got turned around. Somebody had asked me a question, and then I had lost sight of where the tent was as I was talking. And then I thought, well, let me just look and see if I can find the North Star. Well, it was overcast, and I couldn't see any stars. And then I thought, well, I'll just get down close to the ground, and I'll see if I can see a shadow of a tent or an outline. I'm literally walking in the middle of the desert. And so I got down on my knees, and I'm trying to look at the low landscape to see if I can make out a tent or a vehicle or something to start walking towards, or a helicopter. And there wasn't enough light to see anything. It was just completely dark. And I didn't even have a flashlight on me. I'd walked over here and started watching this Super Bowl game. I'd heard about it about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, now it's evening time. And during the day, dogs would lay around the desert, just very docile, individual dogs. You never worried about them. But at night, these wild desert dogs would get together in packs big enough that they would pull a camel down, kill a camel, and tear a camel apart. So just outside of this limited view I had, I started hearing these dogs yipping, and I could hear them panting. They were literally probably only 10, 15 feet from me, but I couldn't see them because of how dark it was. So, you know, I'm nervous. So I pull my sidearm out, cock it, and, you know, so I've got a chambered round in my sidearm as I'm trying to walk and find my way. And I thought, okay, I know if I walk far enough, there's a berm. I can't walk outside of this perimeter because we've got a berm all around us. And I literally walked until I found the berm. And I thought, well, okay, find a vehicle where I'm at here. And I did end up finding a vehicle, and was able to tell that it was a maintenance vehicle. So I assumed it was with our D company, which was our maintenance company. And I thought, okay, now if I start walking in a semi-circle going counterclockwise, I'll finally get back around to where my company is. Well, this is over the course of an hour, hour and a half that I'm walking in the desert, inside this perimeter, totally lost, weapon out. I hear dogs yipping and barking and panting. I'm thinking one of them's going to lunge at me any moment here. But what I didn't realize was that all the soldiers that were on guard duty and sentry duty had night vision goggles on and radios. And they were watching me as the young lieutenant stumble around this perimeter with my pistol drawn, with dogs just outside of my view, having a great time, giving a play-by-play between all their positions. So approximately 2 hours after I left watching this movie, I finally found my way back. I mean, if you can imagine, this circle, this perimeter is over 4 miles around. So I've been stumbling around for a while. I walk into my tent and everyone immediately burst out in laughter, laughing at the young lieutenant, and they tell me the whole story. And I can remember one of our guys, Sergeant Wireman, just giving me the play-by-play of everything they've done. They've kept it in the log for the last hour and a half. He's almost to this position. He looks like he's lost again. So I became Lieutenant Lost for quite a while. And ironically enough, I was the battalion flight lead, the best aviation navigator that we had in the battalion, but was completely lost on the ground. So.
They didn't lose any confidence in you on that, though, did they?
No, but I lost some face with a few folks for a while. Every time I'd go over to the mess tent, somebody had a comment for quite a while after that. And matter of fact, I think that came up in my departure award when I finally left the unit about 1.5 years later.
Well, at least you didn't lose your way to the mess tent.
No, you definitely don't lose your way to the mess tent. So.
What'd you do to bounce back from that?
Well, that was very, very shortly before we actually began the actual combat operations. Up to that point, we'd been flying patrol missions in southern Iraq. We'd actually flown some training missions and security missions in northern Saudi Arabia. But of course, the success that we had over the next couple of weeks really obliterated a lot of that. But I've had to laugh at myself a few times thinking back on that story over the years.
Well, aside from having another helicopter land on top of you, any other close calls?
Probably the most difficult time was during Operation Cayena Point. We had, and very difficult to find, if you looked on a map between Kunar province to Perun, which is in Nuristan province, being with an Afghan military unit, they'd come to a bridge that we would really call one that we were going to have to set up far side security on, and we're taking some pretty heavy machine gun fire, and we could not get the Afghans to cross the bridge. The road was so narrow and up against the Kunar River that we couldn't get our U.S. vehicles past theirs to take the lead to cross this bridge. But sooner or later, somebody has got to cross the bridge, set up far side security so that everybody can get moving down this road. Being stuck on a single lane gravel mud road, you just become a target in a shooting gallery. And myself and several of the sergeants that were with me, we literally got into Afghan vehicles, which were originally U.S. military vehicles. They were called an M113, which was the predominant armored personnel carrier during the Vietnam era, and then after the Vietnam era, prior to the introduction to the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. And literally took their vehicle, kicked them out of it, established far side security, and then were able to get more Afghan vehicles across the road. When you're in a very tight valley, and when you think about the valley, some of these valley walls being 30 and 45 degree angles, 1 or 2 good placed machine guns on a hillside can literally stop a lot of vehicles on a road. That was a very, very tough day. And I'm not sure it was just one day. It was really multiple days getting from Kunar province to Perun. But again, I just credit the great sergeants I had an opportunity to work with, and really through my whole military career, I can honestly say that any success I ever had was directly attributed to just the good group of soldiers I was fortunate enough to work with.
How do you rate the Afghan Army at this point?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I would probably give them about a 0 compared to American standards, but they don't have to be as good as an American military. They need to be better than the insurgency. The thing that I would hope people understand is that governing is very difficult. Running a country is very difficult. An insurgency is easy. An insurgency is just creating some sense of chaos. A very small group can create some sense of chaos. You think about even here in central Indiana, what would it take to cause a sense of chaos in Indianapolis? That's all an insurgency has to do. Make the news, cause a sense of chaos. Whereas governing is very difficult and very expensive and very, very manpower intensive as well.